She was 31 years old. She had just bought a window box of petunias for the front porch, pink ones, because her daughter had asked for pink, and she never got the chance to plant them. On the evening of September 4th, 1981, Carol Ann Pruitt walked out of the Piggly Wiggly on McFarland Boulevard in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who walked away from her life. That is a story about a man who watched her, followed her, and believed he would never be found. And it would take 43 years. A retired detective who refused to file the box away, and a strand of DNA recovered from a paper grocery bag to finally put a name, and a set of handcuffs to what happened on that parking lot. The arrest, when it came, did not bring relief to Tuscaloosa County. It brought disbelief. Because the man they arrested on a Tuesday morning in January of 2024 was not a stranger from out of town. He was not someone who had disappeared into the wind. He had spent more than 4 decades living inside the same community he had shattered. He had sat at church picnics. He had coached a youth baseball team. He had known Carol Ann's daughter by name. That is what this story is about. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Tuscaloosa in the summer of 1981. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Carol Ann Pruitt was. Tuscaloosa in 1981 was the kind of place where August heat settled into the pavement and stayed there through September. The air smelled of cut grass and motor oil and the distant sweetness of the Black Warrior River. On Friday evenings, the parking lot outside the Piggly Wiggly filled with station wagons and pickup trucks. Neighbors stopped each other in the bread aisle. Kids ran in and out of the automatic doors until the manager, Tommy Rayford, told them for the 4th time that it wasn't a playground. Carol Ann Pruitt had been shopping at that store every week for 6 years. She worked the front desk at Coker Ford, a job she'd held since her husband, Danny, had taken sick with a back injury and couldn't work the line anymore. She was the one who answered the phone by the second ring, remembered every regular customer's name, and always had a roll of butterscotch candies in her desk drawer for whoever needed one. Her co-worker, Patsy McAllister, would later say that Carol Ann was the only person she'd ever met who could make a parts inventory feel like a social occasion. She was also a mother. Her daughter, Renee, was 9 years old that September. The age where she still wanted her mama to read to her at night, but would deny it in front of her friends. Carol Ann knew this, and did it anyway. They were reading Charlotte's Web, 1 chapter at a time, because Renee kept asking to start over from the beginning whenever they skipped a night. Danny was at home when Carol Ann left for the store. He remembered it exactly the way people remember ordinary moments that later become significant. Not because anything seemed wrong, but because they replayed it so many times afterward that the edges wore smooth. She had been wearing a light blue blouse. She had asked him if they needed more sweet tea. He said yes. She had kissed him on the cheek and told him she'd be back in 20 minutes. She had been at that Piggly Wiggly 100 times before. The store was 8 minutes from the house. There was nothing unusual about that Thursday evening. The Alabama Crimson Tide had played the week before. Tuscaloosa was still floating on that, and the local news had nothing darker on it than a property dispute out in Holt. Carol Ann put the petunias in the car. She wrote her list on the back of an old receipt. She pulled into the parking lot at 6:41 in the evening. That was the last ordinary moment she ever had. The Piggly Wiggly closed at 8. Carol Ann should have been home before 7:30. By 7, Danny had turned down the volume on the television. By 7:40, he was standing on the front porch. By 8:15, he was calling her sister. Her cart was found in the parking lot at 8:52 that evening. discovered by a teenage stock boy named Marcus Webb, who'd gone out to round up stray carts before close. The cart was parked at the edge of the lot, near the tree line along the service road. It had not been pushed back toward the store. It was sitting between two cars, as if Carol Ann had simply stopped mid-step. Her purse was inside the cart. Her keys were not. Tuscaloosa police arrived at 9:14. They took a report. They noted the cart and the purse. They noted that no one in the store recalled anything unusual, though it was a busy evening and the registers had been running long lines. A cashier named Dorothy Sims said she remembered a woman in a blue blouse, but wasn't sure if she'd come through her lane or not. 3 items from Carol Ann's shopping list were in the cart. She had never reached the produce section. The parking lot sat on uneven ground. At the back edge, near the chain-link fence that separated the lot from the old railway easement, investigators found her right shoe, a flat white canvas sneaker. It was sitting upright on the gravel, as if she had stepped out of it and set it there herself. But Carol Ann Pruitt did not step out of shoes, and she would not have walked toward the railway easement on her own in the dark. The shoe was photographed, bagged, logged. No one saw where she went. No one heard anything. No one reported a disturbance in the lot that evening. Danny filed a missing persons report at the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office the following morning. He drove back to the parking lot 3 times that day. On the 3rd visit, just after noon, a deputy named Roy Edmonds was still walking the service road when he found a torn piece of blue fabric caught in the chain-link fence. It was consistent with the blouse Carol Ann had been wearing. It had a small, dark stain near one torn edge. The lab would later confirm the stain was blood. Carol Ann's car, a 1977 Chevrolet Impala, tan, was found 4 days later parked behind a shuttered laundromat on 15th Street. The driver's seat had been pushed back. Carol Ann stood 5'2". She had not driven it there. What happened in those minutes between the cart and the fence was a question that would define the next 4 decades of one family's life and the careers of several investigators. What happened in those minutes, and who made it happen? That question would stay unanswered for 43 years. The lead investigator on Carol Ann Pruitt's case was Detective Sergeant Harold Tatum of the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office, a 22-year veteran who had worked homicides, missing persons, and 2 high-profile drug cases before this one landed on his desk. Tatum was methodical. He was not the kind of detective who made speeches or held press conferences. He was the kind who showed up to the same locations 3 days in a row, asked the same questions of different people, and noted which answers changed. In the first 2 weeks, his team canvassed the surrounding blocks. They interviewed 37 people who had been in or near the Piggly Wiggly that Thursday. They recovered 6 items from the service road behind the chain-link fence, including a second scrap of fabric and a partial cigarette stub that didn't match any brand Danny Pruitt or his family smoked. That cigarette stub was logged, tested, and filed. In 1981, the available forensic analysis couldn't do much with it. A latent fingerprint on the filter was too degraded to classify. The primary person of interest in the early investigation was a man named Gary Lacey, a part-time mechanic who had worked at a body shop near McFarland Boulevard and had a 1979 assault charge on his record. 2 witnesses placed a man matching his general description, tall, dark jacket, in the parking lot that evening. Lacey was brought in for questioning twice. He had an alibi for part of the evening, a gas station receipt from across town, time-stamped at 7:03 p.m. It was not airtight. But the witnesses couldn't get more specific than tall, and when a 3rd canvass turned up nothing that connected him physically to the scene, Tatum filed Lacey as unconfirmed and moved on. It was the first dead end in a case that would have many. While Tatum's team worked the official track, Danny Pruitt was doing something else entirely. He was making phone calls. He had printed flyers, Carol Ann's photo, her height and weight, the date, and he was driving them to gas stations, laundromats, churches and diners from Tuscaloosa to Northport to Brookwood. He paid for an ad in the Tuscaloosa News. He drove back to that parking lot so many times that Marcus Webb, the stock boy, started watching for him. Renee, 9 years old, went to school on Monday. Her teacher, Mrs. Odom, had been quietly told by the principal what was happening. Renee sat in the front row and did not raise her hand. She didn't cry. She just sat there waiting in the way children wait when they have learned, too suddenly, that waiting is all there is to do. Carol Ann's body was found on October 2, 1981, 27 days after her disappearance, in a stand of pine trees off Route 216 near Foster's. She had been deliberately hidden. Her cause of death was determined by the state medical examiner in Montgomery. The official report was filed. The case was reclassified from missing persons to homicide. Tatum reopened everything. New canvas, new questions. But the parking lot had been rained on a dozen times. The trail was already going cold. And there was nothing left, except the cigarette butt in the evidence box, and a case that for the moment had no answers to give. By 1986, 5 years had passed. The case file had grown thick and then stopped growing. Danny Pruitt had done what people do when grief becomes a permanent condition rather than an emergency. He had returned to work. He had learned to make supper. He sat across from Renee every evening and answered her questions when she asked them, and he did not offer more than she needed to know. She was 14 by then and had stopped asking as often as she once had. By 1993, the mechanic Gary Lacey had moved out of Tuscaloosa County. No new evidence had surfaced. Tatum had retired from the sheriff's department. Before he cleaned out his desk, he made a copy of Carol Ann's full case file and took it home. He put it in a fireproof box in his garage. He told his wife it was a case he wasn't done with. His wife, who had known Tatum for 32 years, understood what that meant. By 2001, the Piggly Wiggly on McFarland had been torn down and replaced by a chain pharmacy. The pines off Route 216 near Foster's had grown in thick. The house next door to the Pruitts had been sold 3 times. The reward poster that had hung in the window of a diner on University Avenue had long since been taken down. Renee was 30 now. She had moved to Birmingham. She called her father every Sunday. By 2009, Danny Pruitt had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease. He had a photo of Carol Ann on his refrigerator and one on his nightstand. He still had the receipt she had written her shopping list on. He had kept it in a small tin box in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where she used to keep her butterscotch candies. Tatum, now in his 70s, was still consulting informally with the sheriff's office when newer investigators asked about old cases. He had walked at least 2 of them through the Pruitt file personally. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, tracking down records, and piecing together lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Carol Ann. The case had been cold for 42 years when a sealed evidence box was pulled from a shelf in a storage facility in downtown Tuscaloosa during a departmental inventory. Inside, still sealed inside its original paper evidence envelope, was the cigarette butt from the parking lot. It was a Tuesday morning in March of 2023 when Detective Sergeant Paula Merritt, 38 years old and 14 years into her career with the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office, sat down with the Pruitt case file for the first time. She had been asked to review a batch of cold cases as part of a state-funded initiative to reprocess biological evidence using modern forensic tools. Most of the cases on her list were straightforward: missing persons, unresolved assaults. The Pruitt file was the oldest in the stack. She read for 2 hours without stopping. When she got to the inventory log for the evidence collected in 1981, she stopped at item 11, cigarette butt, partial. McFarland Bleved parking lot, 0904/81. DNA extraction not attempted, insufficient technology at time of collection. She read it twice. Then she pulled the request form from her desk drawer, filled in the evidence number, and walked it to the forensic unit herself. The process that followed is called touch DNA analysis, a technique that can extract a genetic profile from as little as the saliva residue on a cigarette filter. Laboratories were not capable of this in 1981. They were fully capable of it in 2023. The process takes the microscopic biological material left behind, amplifies it, and generates a DNA profile that can be compared against law enforcement databases and, increasingly, public ancestry registries where ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to trace family history. The lab had a result within 11 weeks. On a Wednesday morning in late June, Paula Merritt's phone rang. She was in her car, parked outside the office, finishing a coffee. The forensic coordinator told her they had a hit, not a direct match to anyone in the criminal database, but a strong familial match through a genealogy registry. The match traced back through second and third cousins to a family that had lived in Tuscaloosa County since the 1940s. Merritt drove directly back to the office. She called Harold Tatum that evening, now 81 years old, living in a retirement community in Northport, and told him what they had. There was a long pause on the line. "I always figured it was someone she knew," he said. "Someone from around here." He was right. The genealogy match pointed investigators toward a man named William Dale Forrest, 67 years old, who had lived in Tuscaloosa County his entire life. Cross-referencing Forrest against the original case record revealed what no one had noticed in 1981. He had lived less than 4 blocks from the Piggly Wiggly. He had been a regular customer there, and in a statement given to a neighbor just days after Carol Ann disappeared, a statement that had been taken informally, never entered into the official file, and filed in a folder marked Community Interviews, Forrest had mentioned, with no apparent reason to, that he had been in that parking lot on the evening of September 4th. Nobody had connected it. Until now, William Dale Forrest had spent 43 years being exactly the kind of man no one suspects. He had worked for the Tuscaloosa County School District for 27 years as a maintenance supervisor. He had coached youth baseball through the Parks Department for a decade. At First Baptist on Lurleen Wallace Boulevard, he was a familiar face in the third pew from the back. His neighbors described him as quiet and helpful, the kind of man who shoveled the walk of the elderly widow next door without being asked. He had never been arrested, had no criminal record beyond a minor traffic citation in 1994. He had known Carol Ann Pruitt's family. Not closely, the way people in a medium-sized southern city knew each other by sight and name and association, through church bulletins and Little League rosters and years of proximity. He knew her daughter Renee by name. He had sat in the same bleachers during a school fundraiser where Danny Pruitt had worked the grill. What investigators now reconstructed, with 43 years of hindsight and a DNA match that put him at the scene, was the picture of a man who had used his ordinariness as armor. The surveillance that followed the genealogy match was careful and methodical. Detectives collected a discarded coffee cup from a fast food restaurant where Forrest was a regular. The Dina from the cup was a direct match to the profile extracted from the 1981 cigarette butt. The probability of a coincidental match, according to the State Forensic Lab's report, was statistically negligible. An arrest warrant was issued on January 14, 2024. William Dale Forrest was taken into custody at 7:22 on a Tuesday morning outside his home on 34th Avenue in Tuscaloosa. He did not run. He did not speak. According to the arresting officers, he looked at the badge, looked at the warrant, and then looked at the ground. He did not look up again until he was inside the vehicle. The news moved through Tuscaloosa County quickly. By noon, the sheriff's office had confirmed the arrest. By evening, local television had run the story. Former neighbors called the station in disbelief. Former colleagues at the school district said they had worked alongside him for years without ever feeling anything was wrong. He brought cookies to the office at Christmas, one told a local reporter. Every year, he never missed. That detail, the cookies, the normalcy, the decades of careful performance, was what most people couldn't reconcile, not because they doubted the evidence, but because they realized that the man they had trusted, the man in the third pew, the man with the shovel on winter mornings, had known what he'd done every single day he sat among them. William Dale Forrest was charged with murder in the first degree. He pleaded not guilty. At the time of this recording, the case is moving through the Tuscaloosa County court system. The prosecution's evidence includes the Dina match, the 1981 community statement placing him at the scene, and additional physical evidence recovered through subsequent investigation that authorities have not fully disclosed. He remains in custody without bond. Harold Tatum, 81 years old, drove himself to the courthouse the morning the charges were formally filed. He sat in the back row. He did not say anything to anyone. He just sat there. There is a photograph of Carol Ann Pruitt, taken in the summer of 1981, a few weeks before September. She is standing in the front yard of the house on 26th Street, squinting a little into the afternoon sun, holding a glass of sweet tea in one hand and laughing at something just outside the frame. She is 31 years old. Her hair is pulled back. She looks entirely like herself. Renee Pruitt, now 52, lives in Birmingham. When the sheriff's office called her on the morning of January 14, 2024, she was making coffee. She had received calls like this before, promising leads, cold case reviews, updates that turned into dead ends. She told a reporter later that she sat down on the kitchen floor when they told her they had someone in custody. Not because she was weak, but because her legs simply had a different idea about what her body needed to do in that moment. Her father, Danny Pruitt, died in 2019. He was 78. He had known, for decades, that there was a man somewhere in Tuscaloosa County who had taken his wife and continued walking the same streets. He never stopped believing the case would close. He just didn't live to see it. Renee placed a photograph of her father next to one of her mother on the day of the arrest announcement. She lit a candle between them. She doesn't know if that counts as something or nothing. She decided it counts as something. Carol Ann Pruitt wanted to plant pink petunias on the front porch because her daughter asked for pink. She had a roll of butterscotch candies in her desk drawer. She read Charlotte's Web one chapter at a time so a 9-year-old girl wouldn't miss a night. 43 years is a long time for truth to travel. But it traveled. Before we close, there are questions worth sitting with. When a man lives inside a community for 4 decades after committing a crime, coaching children, shoveling walks, bringing cookies, what does that say about the face that ordinary life allows us to wear? Is justice still justice when it arrives a generation too late for the people who needed it most? And what do you think should happen when forensic technology finally catches what human investigation could not? Should those cases be guaranteed a reinvestigation, regardless of how old the evidence is? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to share where in the world you're watching from tonight, we'd love to know. Justice found Carol Ann Pruitt after 43 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe and check the description below for more solved cold cases. Thank you for being here.